Hi there, hope you're having a fantastic day. Rob Mays is here on behalf of Envato Tuts Plus, and I'm continuing a series on home mastering. If you haven't seen the previous video or the first part of this series, then I recommend you go check out part 1, where I covered the various steps involved in home mastering, what home mastering is and when it's appropriate. And then in part 2, I went over dynamic processing, so you would have learned about gain staging, compression and limiting. Now in this third part of the series, I want to talk to you about EQ, final checks, metering, dithering, and all the other things that we just need to cover before our master is finished. So let's start off by having a listen to how far we got in the last lesson, just by applying some compression and limiting. So it's sounding pretty good. All I want to do now is just compare this to my references and have a listen, see if there's any EQ adjustments that I need to make before I'm happy with this. So first of all, let's just listen to that Alt-J track, because that's a very similar style and that's the kind of sound that I'm going for. I want to make it a bit more modern than this reference that I'm about to play you. So you'll notice there is more top end in my mix. The Alt-J track has quite a lot of saturation going on in there. There's more aggression in the upper mids around 5k. So I want to kind of make my master a bit more modern sounding. There's a bit more low end there and very top end. It's a bit more pristine. But let's have a listen. So what I'm listening out for is any big differences. I'm kind of going through each frequency range in my head, listening to the bass, thinking, does this sound similar? If not, then what's the difference? Is my track bassy or less bassy? If it's less bassy, do I want it to be as bassy, or do I want a slightly different sound to the low end? And then I'm going into the low mids and focusing on that and thinking, does it have the same warmth and presence? And then I'm going to the upper mids and thinking, does it sound aggressive? Does it have that bite and that edge that I want? And then finally focusing on the top end and thinking, does it sound expensive? Does it sound bright and open? Or does it sound dull and boring and needs more excitement on the top end? So what I noticed there when listening through is that there's quite a lot more low end in my mix, which I kind of want there. Like I said, I want it to have a bit more presence in the sub range around 50, 60 and even below that. But also I feel like the track is lacking some aggression, it's lacking some bite and presence in the upper mid range, and also it feels like it could do with some opening up. It just doesn't sound as aggressive, it doesn't sound as exciting. Let's have a listen again. And don't get me wrong, I like the sound of this mix. I mixed it myself, so of course I like it. But I want to dial in a bit more aggression. Nothing too drastic. So this is how you should approach EQ. Compare it to your references. Think about the differences. Hopefully by comparing it to a reference, you'll straight away hear the differences. And then think about whether those differences are warranted, if you want them to be there, or if you want to take a step towards the reference in certain frequency ranges or away from it. So what I'm going to do now is just show you the curve that I decided on. So I cut some of the very low end out. I added a high pass filter at 20 Hertz actually. And that has the effect of just tightening up that low end a bit. Of course, because we're at 20 Hertz, you can't hear anything below that. But it's also going to affect some of the frequencies before that tiny amount. And it just has, even though it seems like it shouldn't make a difference, it really does. So that's just tightening up the low end a bit. And then I've actually got a low cut, cutting quite a lot, 2.4 dB on everything below 78 Hertz, because by doing that, we're going to bring out some more of this top end. And this is how I tend to approach mastering EQ is have a subtractive mindset. You don't always have to be subtractive. You can use additive EQ. That's fine. If it works, it works. But try and prioritize subtractive. So when I was thinking, well, maybe it could use some more aggression in the kind of upper mid range, instead of just boosting that and, you know, or boosting around 1k here, I actually thought, well, by cutting around 244, that's going to have a similar effect. It's going to remove some of the warmth, and in turn this is going to make the track sound more aggressive. And then here I've actually scooped out some of the upper mids around 1.8 so that the mids around here and here kind of become a bit more revealed. It removes some of that masking and clutter around that frequency range. And this low end cut here is just, first of all, to give the track a bit more volume, because by cutting the bass you give the track more apparent volume, and I just wanted to give it that extra edge. And again, this is going to open up the top end. So now let's listen with the EQ. I'm going to bypass it and unbypass it so you can hear the difference. Wrong track. Let's try again. So it's subtle, but instantly you can hear there's more energy, a bit more presence in the upper mid range. Now it should sound more similar to the reference. I think that's a step in the right direction. But just remember with EQ, prioritize subtractive, but if additive works, it works. Try and keep it subtle. So I mean, minus 0.9, that's a very small cut, minus 0.9 there. The biggest change in sound is definitely coming from this low shelf cut. But I'm happy with that. That sounds great. So now what we want to do is just check the levels. And I'm using the VUMT plugin from Klanghelm. Really cheap. It's about 10 euros. So I recommend picking that up. It's a great little plugin. It just gives you a VU meter to measure the levels. And I've set this to -8, which means -8 dBFS. Because what we want to do is, I've found generally if a mix is pushing -8, averaging around -8, then that's going to give us a lot of headroom. At the same time though, it's going to be loud enough to compete with those commercial tracks. So let's have a look. So that's pretty much perfect. So that's exactly what I want. Hanging around 0, occasionally pushing to even 1 or maybe even 2 dB over 0. But it's hanging around there. So I recommend picking up that plugin if you've got it, but it's not an essential step. Just make sure it looks like there's headroom here. As long as you don't apply loads of limiting and compression, it's going to be absolutely fine. I just put that there just for one final check. And if you do have some kind of VU or RMS metering plugin, give that a go just so you can take a look at those levels. Now, what I'm going to do here before I kind of give this the final okay is I'm going to reference it again to some of my reference tracks, but this time I'm going to use an EQ on the master bus, and what I'm going to do is actually engage the low pass filter and bring it all the way down first of all. And what this is going to do is let me focus in on this low end, and I'm going to compare my mix and my master to several other tracks, and if there's a big change in volume in the low end, then we know that there's potentially a problem if my track's lacking in low end or has too much low end. Before we do that though, let's just check again that these are a similar volume. Now this is the hardest part, because you want your track to be as similar a volume as possible to the reference, but it's never going to be, you're never going to be able to get it spot on. And also my references are different volumes, but that's close enough. So let's have a listen. So that's the Radiohead track. Now let's go to my track. and back again. So I can actually hear more sub. That kick in the Radiohead track is hitting quite hard. But I'm okay with that. That tells me though that there's not too much difference. If I compare it to the Alt J track now, you can hear with that a lot of the energy is actually kind of in that top of that range, around maybe 80 to 100, whereas my track, we've got that one kick hitting. You might be able to hear that in the sub range, but then a lot of the bass is similar. So then what we can do is we can do the same for the top end. Just put a steep filter on. Let's start with Radiohead again. So now I can hear that maybe there is a bit too much very top end on mine. So let's try just doing a very subtle cut. And Alt J. So there's quite a lot less top end in that Alt J track, which is exactly what I expected. And as I said, I wanted mine to sound a bit more modern. So I'm happy with that. Let's just check that that higher cut without the filter now. So very subtle, but I feel that just backs off the sizzle a bit. Let's make that more obvious just so you can hear the difference. And with the filter as well. So it's subtle, but I think that does a good job of just bringing in a bit more aggression. So that we're at that nice midpoint between modern sounding and the classic kind of upper mid-range aggression that you get in a lot of rock music. So cool, I'm happy with that. You can even go through when you're doing this and focus in on specific ranges. So I might want to focus on the higher mids, for example. And you could go through and focus on any frequency range you want. So that's a good little trick there. If you're struggling to hear what your changes are doing, that's a good way to just zoom in quickly on a particular frequency range, just so you can really hear the changes that you're making, and double check your track against the references to make sure there's not any huge differences. And then finally, the last thing we want to do is just dither. So if you've been recording and mixing in 24-bit, you can't just export it at 16-bit. Instead, you need to dither. In Pro Tools, this is actually a plugin. So we want to dither to 16-bit, and we're going to use noise shaping type 2, which is generally the best for kind of rock music and modern music. In Logic and a lot of other DAWs, the dither option is actually part of the export window. But in Pro Tools, you just add that plugin at the end, and that means if we're at 24-bit, we're now going to dither down to 16-bit, and there's not going to be any distortion or anything like that. So that's it. Hope you have enjoyed this series on mastering. Go give this a try. Like you can see, you can do it with all stock plugins. You don't need to use expensive plugins for this. Your main aim here is just final checks to make sure the tone is right. Add in some compression just to change the tone a bit, add a bit more gain reduction, and then finally a limiter just to bring up the volume so that it's in line with commercial recordings. But don't go too aggressive, because you don't need it to be incredibly loud. You just want it to be able to compete. So now let's do a quick demonstration of, let's go without any plugins, and I'm going to have to bring the volume up quite a lot. So that's without mastering, and then let's do with. And let's go back to without. So what I'm hearing is just it has more energy now with those plugins on. Bit more presence in the upper mids, mostly from that low cut. So that's sounding good. And then of course we just bring it to 0, make sure it's 0 on there. One final check. Not clipping, and then we can just highlight the track and bounce it. And make sure you're at 16-bit and 44.1 if you're going to audio, not video. So that's it. Give it a go. Let me know how it goes, and I'll see you again soon.